Thank you. I want to call to order the Measure P Citizens Bond Oversight Committee meeting for December 16th, 2025. And I want to introduce our stand-in secretary tonight, Larissa Cortez.
She's
welcome.
actually the permanent.
Well, permanent
Not
for
for
you.
CBOC.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Sorry.
Permanent for me.
Yes.
Okay. So Larissa, thank you for stepping in.
Thank you.
And would you please call the roll?
Yeah. Bobby Abram. Here. Lucille Boss. Present. Catherine Davidson. Here. Dale Francisco.
Here.
Stephen Fellows.
Present.
Karen Hickman.
Present, and it's hard to be Hickman, and I'm the last one alphabetically. But anyway, go ahead.
Celeste Barber. Samuel Gustafson. Right. Aruni Batuju.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. And may I have a motion to approve tonight's agenda? So moved. Thank you.
Second.
Second. Any discussion?
How do those get made with you and I remember I wasn't here at the last meeting. I
Right.
apologize. But
So
we had some,
this came out, we decided to have a regular discussion between me and Chris and Jordan to come up with a draft agenda.
okay,
And then I'm supposed to get that out to all of you in time for you to make useful comments about
right.
anything that you think could change. I didn't quite get there. So it will be a little earlier next time, but that's the basic idea. We'll come up with a rough draft. And if anyone has comments, suggestions, additions, that's great.
Good.
Okay, so.
Can I get
motion,
clarification
second,
on
any other discussion? Yes.
First and second. Fellows and.
Fellows for,
Thank you.
okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Is there any public comment?
Public comment that I know of.
No
I
public
did
comment.
receive.
Very good. Okay, moving on to information items. First item, 5.1, is the parking lot assessment. Am I missing something? Oh, I am missing something kind of important. Approval of the minutes for the previous meeting. So may I have a motion to approve the minutes of September 16th? So moved. Second?
Second.
Okay, discussion. Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I'm gonna abstain. I wasn't here. I
Okay,
have listened to the meeting.
good, thank you. And no nays. Okay, very good. Motion passes. All right, now on to our information items. And the first one is the parking lot assessment.
On the screen, that'd be great. So we contracted the company to do an assessment of our parking lots. Parking lot repair and repavement was one of the items that we included in the list of possible bond projects. They completed that assessment. The full assessment report, if you're interested in reading it, is available on the board agenda for last month. But I took that assessment and I coalesced it into a much shorter presentation, in part because the maps that they used in that presentation were really hard to follow. They used a color coding system that didn't seem to match up with anything in particular. So I wanted to present it in this way. If we can go to slide 2. So this is a summary of the campuses and the square footage, the condition score, and their cost estimate. So Cliff Campus, and we'll see some detail pages at those scores. That recommendation varies. As you can see, the scores vary. Scores are 1 to 100, with 100 being best, 1 being worst. And the Wake Campus you see there, Shot, as you can see, is the worst. And all of the areas of the Shot Campus, they listed as reconstruct for the parking area, with scores in the 22 to 28 range.
So it's really Shot.
Yes, Shot is Shot.
In their report, they call it the School of Extended Learning,
They did.
but that's not what it is.
Well, the School of Extended Learning is a school that uses both the Wake and Shot campuses for courses, but the actual name of the campus is Shot.
Right, that's what I thought. And
Yeah.
there is a campus called School of Extended Learning in Goleta, is that right?
It's the Wake and the Shot are the name of the campuses. Extended Learning uses those two campuses to offer.
No, I
class.
got that, but I looked
Yeah.
up, then I thought, what is this? So I looked up the School of Extended Learning, which is somewhere out on Hollister in Goleta. Or so I
On
found it
Turnpike.
there.
So the School of Extended Learning is comprised of the two campuses, Wake and Shot. So it's the same, so it's not a location. It's
Okay.
The School of Extended Learning is offered on those two campuses.
Okay, it's just yeah.
Okay, we can go to the next slide. So I put campus maps that are available on our website and I them up with the report and you can see the areas of the parking that were identified, the square footage. There's obviously, if you add those square footage numbers up, they don't quite add up to 88,129. There's some additional areas connected to the lots. But you can see the condition scores are very poor.
Mm.
And the cost estimate to repair that is approximately 1.6 million. In the report, they have a 5-year schedule that they're recommending for improving the lots.
Mhm.
I do not have any idea why, but they put this campus with the worst score at the end of those 5 years. And we don't intend to do it in that order. We intend to do it first. When I presented this to the Board of Trustees, they agreed it doesn't make sense to repair the worst lots last. So that is our plan there.
And what does repair look like? Is it just completely resurfacing, all new electrical, power, parking spaces, striping, the whole 9 yards?
Yeah, it's just the paving, striping. So in this one, they're recommending reconstruction, which means we're gonna dig up some of the existing asphalt, put in new asphalt, and then slurry coat it, which is the coating on top, and add the lines. They we will have to assess the lots through the Department of State architect. Prior to 2 years ago, they didn't care so much about parking lots, but now because there are certain requirements for the number of EV parking locations per lot, now they want to review it, and they always have a minor review in terms of ADA access from those lots and paths of travel. So the ADA access and paths of travel won't change at all. The only potential change would be if they require us to put in an additional EV parking spot.
Thank you.
So then there's potentially infrastructure upgrades as well.
There could be if they require EV parking.
So I just got out the project list we got sometime. June bond project list.
Yes.
Okay, so I noticed this one, you told me, so this one was estimated at $2 million. And it came in less. I didn't think that ever happened.
That's their estimate, and we still have to.
This was is that where this number came from?
That is also an estimate. It came before the full assessment.
Oh, no, right. I noticed this came in June and
Yes.
that just happened.
Yes,
So where did that one come from? Or do you know? I don't care.
I was not here at that time, but
Oh.
I assume they did an assessment, but not a full workup like this was.
Okay, well,
If we can go to the next slide. This is a little harder to see, but if you've been to the Wake campus, you drive in, and then if you go to the very back of the campus, it goes downhill. So in order to fit the map,
So to speak.
Yeah,
Sorry.
literally not in terms of the program. So in order to fit the map, I had to split it into two parts. So the main area where courses are offered is on the right-hand side, and then the bottom section where it declines into those parking lots is on the left-hand side. You can see the areas identified and their recommendation in terms of rehabilitation, light or heavy. It looked like from their scoring that if the score is below 70, they scored it heavy rehab. And then they provided the cost estimates for that as well, which is about $2 million for the Wake campus. Any questions there?
and that one's on this part at 1.2.
Yes, and this came in a little higher.
Are we gonna get a copy of this? Or
Yes,
is it-
it's on
Alright,
the,
make sure.
I wasn't on the one okay.
I'm curious because I don't know anything about
please.
parking lots and,
Yeah.
and all of that sort of
Yes.
stuff. So I was curious about the assessment process. I mean, do they take core samples? Do they just kind of walk around? Do they take pictures? Do they dig around? I mean, how does this assessment process result in the condition score?
Yeah, so they go and visit every location, they take photos. If you look at the full document, if it's long, primarily because it has a lot of photos of different parking sections. They'll take samples, depending on the level of the cracks in the pavement, to see how deep they go and how much damage there is, and to determine light rehab versus heavy rehab, for example. Or at the Shaw campus, the full reconstruction. So they took a look and determined that at this point, we really need to tear it out, put it back in, put in a new one.
So light rehab would probably just be a slurry coat,
It might be filling the cracks first.
filling the cracks and doing a
And
slurry
then the
coat,
slurry coat.
whereas heavy rehab would be a bit more, but not quite as much as full reconstruction.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
If you wanna know and you open that 5-year plan, it's all in there.
I'm sure it is.
Well, yeah, 150 pages. Okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Any-
And so what does
Did you send me
maintenance
one?
entail then? You've got some that are just recommendation is just maintenance. That's
Agenda.
the lightest of all.
That'd be just a start code for us.
Okay.
So it doesn't have
Oh,
a
I
fixed
got
number
that.
of cracks.
I was looking
We
for
were going to
that.
work to fill those cracks and.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
that's okay. I can get it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
absolutely. If we can go to the next slide, so there are two slides for the Cliff campus, the east, which we're on now, and west, which is across the bridge. So you can see here that I had to label lot 1B, which is a long lot, 3 sections, by the administration building, which is sort of to the left of that building labeled A. By the stadium, which is a tiny section of parking down by the stadium, and then the wraparound, which is the remainder of that lot that goes around from the left to the bottom of that image. And some sections are in decent shape, some sections are not so great shape. Lot 1A, which is the lot that I believe you may have parked in today, is labeled for heavy rehab, so it's not in such great shape as other parts of the campus. And then there's a service road that is hard to see on the map, but it essentially runs from, on this map where you might see the word campus safety, and it runs down between the campus and Pershing Park. Any questions on this one? Okay, we can go to the west campus. Map. So you can see here that all of the scores in the initial lot 4A, B, C, D, and the entrance road are all listed as light rehab. There was a robust discussion at the board meeting and some disagreement about that value. The board members seem to feel that in the entrance road, especially as you would turn towards the main parking structure, that the road is in worse condition that this indicates. And there was a preference by board members to prioritize getting that area done sooner rather than later. So we'll probably be working on that. The lot 4E is down at the bottom, which is by our maintenance area. It's also the last lot you would get to before you would go out onto the lawn there. And then the access road is, in this case, is the one that goes all the way behind the parking structure and sort of ends in a roundabout by the IDC building.
As you're looking at the rehabbing of all of these parking lots,
Yes.
does the rehab include any kind of redesign of parking itself, the actual parking program itself? numbered spaces identified for different purposes than what is currently identified for? I mean, is there a whole new parking schema that goes along with the rehab of parking, or does the current parking just stay as it is? The program stay as it is, and it's just a rehab of the surface spaces.
For this work, it'll stay as it is. It's just a rehab of the surfaces.
Is that a missed opportunity, or is that let's just kind of leave things like they are and not mess around with parking?
Well, in terms of the numbering, we don't require folks to identify the parking spot that they're in. But if there's some desire, if it makes sense to number spots in order for people to remember where they parked, for example, that could be an opportunity when we get to the striping and painting to do that. There are some requirements, especially on this side in lots 4, in the 4 section, that we would like to consider some changes, but we have to go back and have a conversation with the Coastal Commission. So part of our long range development plan included a certain number of carpool spaces, and the use of that number of carpool spaces has reduced over time. But in order for us to make that change, because the long range development plan is approved and ratified through Coastal Commission in part, and we committed to them a certain number of carpool spaces, we would have to go back to them and say, we're changing our plan. We want fewer carpool spaces or whatever.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
So could I?
See that last one? I just want to see the last one. I didn't write that number down. The last slide. Can you get back to that easily?
The one before?
Yeah. Okay, that's good.
So I heard you say at the beginning that this is a 5-year plan to do all of these parking lots in all of these campus areas.
The report produced a 5-year plan for that purpose. We're not sure yet. We're thinking possibly over the course of 3 years. We have a process going to the board for them to approve the bidding process for this. And then assuming they approve that at their meeting this week, then it would go out to bid for planning and the construction company that would come in early spring for that bid to be approved. And part of what we're asking that company to do is to identify the 3-year plan or the 5-year plan, or some sort of plan, and to identify which spaces in order, etc.
Okay, so it's up to the paving company, as it were, to come up with the sequence of events.
The paving companies that bid will make the proposal, and then we'll accept whichever one makes the most sense in terms of acceptance by the campus that the board would approve.
Because where are all these people going to park when their lots are being rehabbed? And it's a temporary problem, and it's a first world problem. I get that, but just like, we've been making accommodations for the PE program to go elsewhere in the city while the gym is being redone and all of that. So what are the thoughts on parking?
Typically, when we redo parking, we try to do it either in the summer when there's less of an impact in terms of the number of people on campus, or in the winter break. So a lot of our classes finish this week, last week, and then start again in the last week of January. So there's some opportunity then, and there's some opportunity in the summer to have less of an impact. They won't have no.
But less of an impact.
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly. Steve?
I'm curious, with the I guess heavier rehab and reconstruction, will we lose or gain any spaces? I'm specifically thinking about the tree roots that I imagine will continue to come back at the lot right over here, or shop center. I think they're really tight spaces. So will there be any of that kind of redesign?
It depends. We're hoping to keep a similar number of spots. If the Department of State Architect has different requirements for us, then it may, for example, if the spots are too narrow and it's too wider, it could result in fewer spots. The tree roots, part of the work would be to trim the roots where possible. and put back the same parking spot.
Thank you.
Sure.
So nothing's proposed for that lot that's right next to the track.
That is correct, and part of the reason for that is that is a city lot.
Oh, I don't think I knew that.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a strong joint use agreement with the city. So that particular lot is owned by the city. And we would work with them on any maintenance efforts we do there. Also in Pershing Park, you did see a little bit of Pershing Park on here.
Mhm.
Our property line is a little awkward in Pershing Park, so it includes some components of the hill in Pershing Park and some part of the parking lot of Pershing Park, but not the rest of it.
Oh, because that's the city.
Because that's the city's,
Uh-huh.
right? And so we have a joint use, for example, for use of the tennis courts and baseball area and things like that. So we would be responsible to redo the part that's on our property and then the city for their portion.
And I trust the city is very cooperative in
Yes.
working with them. Yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Sure.
The clarification on that one. So I understand like the Ledbetter, that city, but the parking lot that is immediately outside of the track,
That's also city.
that's it. Oh, whatever. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great question.
Okay, I think that is the end of the presentation. I believe the next one is just a giant question mark.
Okay, so when will this go out to bid?
Assuming the board approves the bid process this month.
Okay.
It would go out to, we would advertise over the course of December and January. We would start accepting bids after that.
Okay. Okay,
And I'm just curious, who develops the RFP?
We're working with an attorney firm.
So I have a question. I don't know if anyone has been here long enough to know the answer to, but when I've talked about this issue before with transportation engineers, and the pavement condition index is to some extent subjective. They don't have a conditionometer that they can put down and it tells them an exact number. But what I've heard is that once that number gets somewhere in the high 60s, that's a point of no return. That's a point at which the condition is bad enough that there's going to be water infiltration and other problems that are inevitably going to cause more deterioration.
Yes.
And if you look at Shot, which is the shining example, that's practically back to bare ground.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, because obviously maintenance is a big issue. And maintenance is how this bond measure primarily was sold to the people who are going to be paying for it.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, how do we get to that point where there must have been red flags long before Shot got into the condition it is today? And was the board not made aware of that, or what happened?
You know, I can't speak to what the board was made aware of in the past, since I haven't been here that long. What I can say is the state does a curious thing with parking lots, which is that they allow us to charge a parking fee, but they keep the limit of that parking fee very low. Because they allow us to charge a parking fee, we get 0 state dollars for scheduled maintenance parking lots. So districts are required to come up with funding some other way. So I can only assume that past decisions were made to spend any locally generated dollars on other maintenance projects. But I wasn't here, so I can't speak to it.
so that begs the question about why not set up a maintenance program after we get these beautiful parking lots done?
I think that's certainly advisable.
Yes.
But our
A
job,
regular maintenance program.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
certainly.
But ultimately, you have to be able to charge sufficient to maintain it. And if you can't charge what it costs to maintain it, you're back in the hole.
Yeah, it's a little bit.
Well, if you
And
want
if you've got to deal with
if you
the
want
coastal
more-
commission, you're back in the hole. So
Well, if I can offer, I think another part of this too is that there was a lot of leadership change turnover at the college over a 15-year period at various levels. And there were and in that time, They did not pass a bond in 2014, and then they got money for the PE building. And then should we go for a bond? And all of this was happening. Meanwhile, there were changes and there was no long range planning happening. And I think what we're doing right now, and hopefully what we'll continue to demonstrate, is that the long range planning is happening. So yes, we do these projects, we get the paving in place, and then my more than capable, fantastic chief business officer over there starts thinking about, so what's our capital improvement plan and how do we space out, making sure that we are paying attention to these things. So I think what you're seeing is the beginning of putting that system in place.
I think that would go a long way to for the public to trust what you all are doing. You know, if you've got a plan in place, it doesn't matter what the leadership is going, you just follow the plan,
Yeah,
you know?
I believe in president proofing an institution. And
There you go.
basically, if you president proof an institution, you set all the systems in place
Mhm.
so that if there is a change in leadership, there's still a plan and there are still
Yes.
people where they need to be to get that plan done.
Yes.
And that's basically my
Yes.
goal as president.
Yeah, and I'd, rather see money go into the maintenance budget than money being taken out of the maintenance budget for other things.
Yes.
Yeah.
We are
Thank
on
you.
the same page.
All right, thank you.
Okay, if there's no further questions or discussion about that, let's move on to the next information item, which is an update.
We might just note that those things were estimated in the bond project list at over $11 million. And they look like they're up there for how much, Chris?
8.5.
8.5, okay.
But we'll wait,
We'll see.
wait till we see.
No, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
So at least we know.
That's the assessment value.
yeah.
Moving right along, been there, done. The update on the physical education replacement project. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Karen Cowan. I'm the Senior Project Manager with Kitchell. And my day-to-day is watching that project. So I wanted to give you a quick update. And first I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to sit here and chat with you a little bit tonight. This is a very exciting project and I'm having a lot of fun with it. So since you last received an update, which I believe was in September, some key milestones have been met. We have finished the interior abatement of the building, interior and exterior abatement of the building. So there was a asbestos in exterior texture coating, and mastic and a lot of places. And as we continue to do interior soft demolition, we continue to find more asbestos in hidden places and fireproofing, and it was above ceilings and a little. Yeah, so, but we have completed all of that. So, so all of that has gone very well. Took a little longer than expected. We added a couple of weeks to that overall schedule, but we are done. But because of the way that they progressed with that work, we were able to actually release the other contractor, PCL Construction, who's actually tasked with doing the structure demolition. They were able to get started a couple of weeks early. So little extended time for the abatement guys, but a little time gained for the structural guys, so it all kind of worked out in the wash. That structural demolition is progressing well. And they're actually at this point roughly about 85% complete.
Yeah.
Most of the materials that you're seeing coming down is being processed, separated, and recycled. So steel is going over here, concrete's going over there. We have, again, encountered more asbestos materials. Oh my. Most of that has been in waterproofing materials that have been under slabs or behind retaining walls, and also transite pipe. Most of that has been storm drain piping that we didn't even know was there. It was buried and didn't show on existing drawings. So we've been handling remediation of that as we've been going along. That is all progressing well. It's actually going faster than we had originally scheduled, so that is progressing well. So as far as our budget, there have been 2 change orders issued to the demolition and abatement contractor to date. Chris is in the process of preparing a fiscal report, and that will be presented in January. Correct? While much of the cost was offset by an allowance that was built into that contractor's contract, it wasn't quite sufficient, and all of that will be detailed in Chris's report. There is a change order that is currently being processed for PCL. Most of those changes are necessitated by the fact that the project sat on hold for a long time. From the time it was actually approved by the state to the time that we're actually able to start work on it. Some products have been discontinued, some things have become obsolete. We're trying to get things current, and as we're moving along, it's a very small, I would call it minor overall change order, and that one's currently being processed right now. Some key issues that we've run into, as you know, we have moved the fencing on the south side of the project to allow, it's kind of blocked off the main entrance to the stadium. But before we did that, we provided a new entrance to the stadium, both for pedestrians and for vehicles. Really no issues with any of that. It modified the traffic pattern slightly. So far, all of that has gone very well. Notifications went out, maps were issued. There have been no issues with exiting or entering that parking lot, so that has all gone well. We've also, as you've seen, moved the fencing on the north side in 1B. Both of these fencing relocations are going to remain in place for the duration of the project.
1B is that, remember the map, it's that long wraparound road.
Yeah.
It's
East
here on
Campus.
East Campus.
Yeah.
It was in front of administration and around by the state.
And when you get a moment, could you explain the change order approval process?
Sure.
Keep going, but
Okay.
if we could come back to that, please.
Sure. And then, okay, so other milestone events. We had a big rainstorm last month,
Yeah.
a really big rainstorm, and it was more than 10 inches. Based on the rain gauges that we have placed on our project site, it was more than 10 inches on that one rain event. And it could have been disastrous, and actually it really didn't end up being that bad for us. We had a little bit of mud escape our job site. And again, some of that was from a storm drain system that we didn't know was there, that we had to remove because it was transite pipe. That was managed and cleaned up within a matter of hours, and there have been no further issues since then. And our team has been doing an exceptional job of keeping the storm water pollution prevention systems in place. We are fully prepared for this the rain events that are forecasted for next week. In the next quarter, what we're looking for is completing all the demolition and abatement work. We will start installation of shoring on the hillside. We will begin some additional soil testing and confirmation with our geotechnical engineer, because we have differing soil conditions on the site. And we weren't able to, because there was a building in the way, we weren't able to confirm exactly where we've got good soil on one side and not so good soil on the other side. The closer to the beach we are, the less stable it is. The further up the hill it is, the more stable it is. But we don't know where these two different conditions actually meet in the middle, because there was a building in the way, so we couldn't do borings. Once the building's out of the way, we can do some additional testing. So once the buildings are completely removed, some additional soil exploration will take place. We will be able to do further determination of where the good soil is, where the not so good soil is. So we know what needs to be done supplementally to seismically stabilize that soil, where it starts and stops. And then we'll be able to start playing in the dirt and begin our grading activities and foundation preparation and all of our utility work.
Right, if you want to speak to the, sort of how the changeover process starts and bring it to us.
Oh, yeah, well, there's a lot of steps along the way. Usually a change is initiated by questions that come in from the contractor or a change that is initiated by the design team to update something on the plans. Oftentimes something that's a little out of date. Usually it's initiated with a review of a submittal or a question that comes in from the contractors and the subcontractors. In response to that, we realize a change needs to be made. Contractor will give us pricing, there's a review process, a little bit of haggling, a little bit of negotiating, a little bit of back and forth. We get down to a price that their team has reviewed, my team has reviewed, we feel we've gotten it down to a fair and reasonable price. We've reviewed the labor rates, that everything is according to prevailing wage. And everything is fair and accurate, all the markups meet the contract requirements. Chris and I have a conversation about it. Usually we have a conversation along the way.
Right.
Because there's no surprises along the way. And then we usually wait and hold a few of these things together, and then we'll pull them together into one change order. Chris and I will talk about it, the contractor and I will talk about it. Everybody's in agreement on the numbers, and if there's any adjustments to the schedule, that will also be included. These will all be compiled into one document, and then it gets circulated for signatures. Bless you. Now, I'll also say that sometimes these changes may require a review by DSA. If it requires any kind of modification to the drawings. So those are processes that already happen along the way as well. It'll require a construction change directive. And that gets reviewed by DSA and they stamp it out. That gets issued as, it all gets packaged into this big heavy duty document. Usually I don't, yes.
I'm sorry,
Go ahead. No,
at that point, does it have to go to the coastal commission as well? Or is it small enough that it doesn't trigger coastal commission overview?
It's small.
It's
Okay.
small enough and.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's entirely, and that's a fair question, because some of the changes that we're actually incorporating right now, like the one that we have, incorporated some of the coastal commission's requested changes.
Oh, there you go.
Once it gets to the final step of the process, the board, when they approved the contracts, gave authorization for Princeton and for Jones to approve change orders within 10% of the total initial contract value. Anything greater than that would have to go back to.
That's very helpful.
Sure.
Mhm.
Some of these documents can get extremely lengthy, so I typically don't like to include hundreds of pages. So the change orders, I prefer to provide hot links. So if anybody wants to do a deep dive into all the documentation, there's a lot of links, because otherwise it can be hundreds of pages of documentation, and that can be really cumbersome.
Yeah.
So,
I imagine there's going to be a lot of change orders over the course of all of this work.
it's a very, very large project, and there will be. And there's a lot of documentation that goes along with every little change, honestly.
Yeah.
Because there's full transparency, everything's above board. So, there's a tremendous amount of documentation. There has to be.
Yeah.
It's taxpayer dollars, there should be.
Yeah.
So,
I have a question.
yes, ma'am.
So when do you think we would be ready for groundbreaking?
That's something that we're looking at right now. And that's that's the whole playing in the dirt.
Yes.
Sort of. As soon as we stop finding asbestos, I might have a better idea.
Got it. Okay.
The demolition process, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back with the asbestos. That has been our biggest hurdle at this point. It's been really frustrating for everybody.
We are hoping for early spring, maybe
Yeah.
February or March.
Okay.
And you all will be well aware, my office will be reaching out and giving you a heads up of when those dates would be. But
And Jordan and I are in communication on trying to keep them updated on things as they progress. It's just, like Friday when they found a couple more transite pipes, it's like, when is it gonna stop?
What is the communication of the nature of the project or the extent of the project to the college community, as well as to website updates.
So the nature of communication is once we have updates, we go ahead and put them in. We haven't really had a significant update. Like once we have the groundbreaking, we'll have that information up and we'll go from there. Once you all, this on your board agenda, once we have the annual reports input, that will be a refresh to our website. But in terms of communicating with campus, we communicate as needed. There's changes with parking, we let the campus know. But the date for completion has always been spring 2028.
The only reason I ask is that having done very large projects in the past, almost on a weekly basis, I get somebody asking me, where are we on this project? And I discovered pretty quickly the easiest thing for me, just put it out there on a regular basis, but it sounds like that's what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think what's also great, because the building was so large, you can just go down there and you can see that most of the building's gone.
Yeah.
And it's kind of exciting to see how
Yeah.
quickly that's happened. And whenever we have conversations with people, ask, I say, oh, just go look.
Yeah.
And people are always surprised at how quickly this.
The pedestrian bridge is a
Mhm.
fantastic spot for
Oh,
the students to view it.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, like during demolition, we'd have crowds of students lining the bridge just watching this demolition going on. And cheering as a section of wall would come over or whatever. So, yeah, it's been.
Well, heads up, as soon as you finish your topping out, as soon as you put the skin on the building, you can't see inside
Oh, and
anymore.
everybody's gonna say, why?
And that's where 90% of the
Yeah.
work is occurring is on the inside.
Oh, I know.
So just heads up, I
Yeah.
think that, just keep that in mind for future reference. That's all.
Absolutely, as a marketer here, I love content, and that's the opportunity where I'm like, hey,
Yeah.
when can we go in and take videos and get that on our social media?
Oh, there you
We
go.
definitely want to market this as much as
Well,
possible, because it's a value add to our campus and our.
And I provide reports to Chris and try to include a lot of photos. Maybe sometimes too many photos, but there's a lot of really good photos and they do aerial photos. The contractor does a lot of aerial photos. Sometimes the resolution is too much that it's hard to actually get it to you. They're fantastic, high resolution, really cool stuff. So those
Maybe
reports
it's like
are
that to do construction, the perception that progress is happening.
Well, the expectation is once the skin goes on the
Right.
building, we're just about done.
Yeah.
Of course.
And we've got 80% of the building to complete.
Yeah.
So
I know.
So
that's all.
please follow us on LinkedIn or Instagram. You'll see the posts every other week. We pretty much post the progress.
Great, thank you.
Well, and the QR code. The kids are able to pull that up all the time. There's a lot of public interest in the project. People walk by it, drive by it, see it all the time. People are posting on Facebook what they see about it. There's a lot of excitement.
Just out of curiosity, where does the asbestos go?
Most of it ends up at a facility in Arizona.
Okay,
That's what the receipts all show.
so it's loaded up on a truck and hauled out to Arizona. Okay.
Most of the facilities in California are full.
Or don't want it.
I think they're pretty much just full. We've done a lot of remediation and for many years in California, so all full up.
Thank you.
We're also, as we're progressing, we're trying to find smart ways that we might be able to help offset some of these cost overruns that we run into with asbestos and some potential schedule savings as well. Once some of these ideas, if we're doing some investigation right now, and if they actually develop into something, hopefully I'll have something better to report to you at the next one. Fingers crossed.
Well, thank you for staying so on top of everything and
That's
for-
for, and I love it.
well, I'm complimenting you on a job well done
Thank you.
and keeping the communication flow. going. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for having me tonight.
Well, thank you for being here. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so Dale,
Yes,
can I just say, while I was learning, I found a time lapse video from the bridge of the PE building. It's somewhere online. I just don't know where.
So that is for IT, that one's available on campus Wi-Fi. But we are gonna take footage and eventually release it to everybody once it's ready, but we have to be on campus.
You'd have to get with Oren and the guys to see if you can get the full archive of it. I think they only keep like a compilation of like the last, it's like every 10 minutes and it only holds like 30 minutes of the last 30 minutes. So it doesn't give you the full beginning to end.
Yes,
They may archive.
they are for me.
Okay, good. As long as you. Because you should.
You're a little different. They are for you.
And-
They're great.
And I'm gonna find that email right now for the other two cameras
Thank you.
that the contractors put up.
So I'll go ahead and share those with you because that's through Kitchell. They have other cameras that you'll be able to see on any Wi-Fi.
That's actually the contractors. And you have to download some software and then follow the instructions very carefully.
great. Okay, so Chris, you're going to talk to us about the bond work group process? Is that right?
Sure, I can introduce it and President Ernest wants to jump in.
Oh, okay.
Fine too. So we're forming a campus committee. It's sort of a subgroup of the planning council on campus. And so all of the constituent groups have assigned members to this work group, and their role starting in spring will be to meet and go through the list of projects that are posted online as optional or as possible projects for the bond. Prioritize those and sort of help us make decisions about what will happen first, what will happen next, what's a little bit of longer term goal. And then
So the bond work group will recommend a prioritization of the projects to our college council. And they'll take a look at it and recommend them to me, and then I recommend them to the board. So it's a multi-step process, but the goal is to get everybody's perspective. The two exceptions, obviously, to the bond work group, to the prioritization process are PE building, because obviously we did that as a priority. And then the paving, because the paving, we know we need it on all the campuses. We know we needed it yesterday. So that leaves all the rest of the projects that were there. And so the bond work group will talk about, okay, if we assume we have this amount of money and we assume we've already committed X amount and X dollars to completing the PE building and doing the paving, this is what we have left. Here are the projects. How do we want to prioritize them? For example, in that list, there's a replacement of the physical sciences building, I believe. But that's on there, assuming that we're going to, and we do have what are called initial plan proposals and a final plan proposal in with the state to get matching funds for that building. But that's a longer term process. So we have to think about, okay, is that a priority, or should we try to get some of those smaller projects done? Because the state doesn't have bond funds available to fund any of the projects. So we have to take a look at all of those. And the list gets revisited on a regular basis because some things can change. You know, if the state suddenly passed a bond, we would definitely want to get our names in there, you know, or try to move up in that process. We also might have something break on campus. We might, you know, so there are a lot of things that go into that prioritization, and it constantly gets reviewed because you just never know, there might be something that happens. But ultimately, it is the responsibility of the Board of Trustees to decide which projects go forward And then obviously it's your responsibility to hear how we're doing and what processes we used and that we're using the money.
Just an example of something that happened that is a change that maybe they will consider. So we have a building on the west campus that during the last rainstorm had some pretty significant leaks that showed up and that didn't have those leaks previously. And when they investigated, what they found is that the building was, this happens unfortunately in my mind, the building was designed so that the runoff system for the rain goes through pipes that are the interior of the building, not on the exterior. And those pipes had cracked on the top of the pipe. So that if the amount of water flowing through them was not a lot, you would never know there was a crack because it wouldn't leak. But in the recent rainstorm, the volume of water was so great that the amount of water in those pipes overflowed from the top of the pipe out onto the surfaces below. So that's a recent discovery, for example, that unfortunately some of those things happened. We didn't know that there was a repair needed, and now due to this natural event, we do know. So.
Eric, I had a question. So you said there at the end that ultimately this is entirely up to the Board of Trustees.
Yeah.
What those priorities are. Is there any state agency that pokes its nose into these issues?
No.
Okay.
They don't. They poke their nose in the places they're allowed to poke their nose. So we have the Coastal Commission, obviously, and then we have the Department of the State Architect. But in terms of what buildings we choose to build, that is 100% a local decision.
Okay.
And why we have locally elected boards.
Thank you. Anything else on this topic? Okay. Gordon,
Thank you, Chair.
I think you're on.
All right, so if you can go ahead and open that document. So as you all know, we have to prepare a report to the community on Measure P. And what we provided here is just a simple template just to give you an understanding of what it could potentially look like and start the conversation of what content you all as representatives would like to see. The goal here is for us to decide on what that content might be. And then by your next meeting, we would have that content written for you to review and then hopefully get approval and then send that out into the community by late spring. So right here you can see, so imagine it's thank you, Lucille. It's folded like Lucille has. So it's just one page folded over. And we have a front cover of our two students. And then if you scroll down, please, the inside would then be a message from the chair, any financials, a brief overview, lots of photos of the building, more financials at the bottom. And then at the back, there would be different stories about the progress of the building and hopefully looking into the future. So these are just placeholder template text. Yeah. Sorry, with Erica's signature.
Is this something that ultimately goes to the board for approval, or is this something that
No, this
we
is,
approve?
yeah, this is your report to the community. This is not
Supposed to be an
board
independent committee.
purview. This is
Yeah.
all you.
Yeah. And what would happen is we would probably print a small run, but we would also put this on all of our social medias and share this out as widely as possible, likely with a press release as well. We would give you all printed copies so that you can go to your respective constituents, and if they have questions, you can be prepared with your reports. But that aside, we would post this on our website and make sure that it gets as disseminated as widely as possible. We do a small run just because we want to be conscientious of paper use. And normally when we mail out stuff to our district, they get really upset about us wasting paper. So. Yeah, we want to, yes.
I wonder if you could mail out a postcard with like a QR code.
Yes,
Something
we
like
can
that.
definitely do that. That's what we did with, I think, our our annual report last time we did. We sent out a.
Yeah, it was
poster
big,
with the-
And when's this due out?
We would get it out the end of spring semester likely, so May.
Oh, May.
So my goal is, if you all are happy with this, we would develop content. Your next meeting, I believe, is in March. So we would have a draft for you all to review and you could give me feedback. Hopefully you're happy with that draft and we can just go send it out. But if not, we would come back in our June meeting for any feedback and then get that finalized and out to the community.
Right. So, oh, go ahead.
I was thinking because there may not be as much on the financials to report yet.
Yes.
If you have like a Gantt chart that shows a timeline of
Yeah.
like what's happened already and what's happening next.
Absolutely.
That could fill some of the space.
So by then you might have an idea of the work of the bond work group process
Yes,
and all of
yeah.
that. And here's what we're thinking right now, subject to change, but
Mhm.
here's what we're thinking right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
And the goal is also, if we have the groundbreaking, we can put the photos in here and talk about that process.
So if, let's say it's going out right now, and I'm looking at what our committee is charged to do. Well, let's just think, what would we have paragraphs on our story about?
And so paragraphs in your story would talk about the updates that you've had, and you've now had a year of meeting, almost a year of meetings. In March, you'll have that. You'll talk about all the different updates that you've been given and
But let's go a little, they're gonna be a little smaller. I mean, is one gonna be about paving?
No,
No.
so what we'll have, we'll work with Chair to write his
Sure.
message. But I think what we're gonna look at is just kind of like big picture. I think a timeline's a great idea, because we could have little vignettes of, at this point, this is what we discovered. At this point, we discovered there was more asbestos, and this is why it was delayed. At this point, this is where it is, you know, and kind of paint the picture in the narrative of what's going on, so that's just very clear. That makes sense?
Are you asking about the stories, the actual stories?
Right. No, well, I'm just thinking of, because I mean, I think we ask questions that are not really in our purview.
Yeah.
But that's, I mean,
So-
we're curious.
One story could be, we had a groundbreaking, the next story could be, well, what's next? And we can talk about the bond work group and
Yeah.
potential paving the parking lot.
Well, I was gonna
If
say-
The community would be so happy.
You're gonna have we're gonna look at an audit that you're gonna have in March. So, and to me, there's gonna be two big expenditures on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The building and the, so would we have a little story about each one of those and what we know about them? That's all I was.
And I think
Thank you.
I think it's legitimate to include somewhere in there about the fact that you all have asked really good questions. Like, you're figuring out what your official purview is, but you're asking questions to make all that make sense too,
Yeah.
and that's important.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you're going outside of your scope. It's, the CBOC inquired about the following things and wanted to understand how the college arrived at this decision, and that's well within, that's completely
Yeah.
reasonable, and I think the public would want to know that you're taking the time to educate yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that I really appreciate about these last meeting minutes, how detailed they were. So-and-so asked this is how the question was answered. And by putting that in writing, in an official public document, then
Yeah.
the public can see that, yeah, we are asking great questions
Mhm.
and we are getting answers to those questions. Yeah.
And I think that's a narrative that we would talk to you as a chair, how we can crowd that and how this group is really asking those questions and getting answers.
Yeah, we should also include the fact that we sold a bunch of bonds.
Right, that's what I'm thinking.
Absolutely.
That it's gonna be in there. It's gonna
Oh,
be
that
paving, the
We-
bond,
we- Yeah,
And the progress on the building.
and the progress on the
I imagine
building, and if it got
that's-
behind, why.
Sure. There might be a before and what it looks like now, there's a lot of
We
ways
have a
to
lot of
approach it.
content.
Mhm. More content than you think you have, that is there.
Speaking of content, I realize there isn't a whole lot to say on the financials right now. And I also realize that you want something that the general public is going to read and get something out of. and that has to be brief, but there's no limit to what we can put
You can put
online.
as many pages as long, yeah.
And I think I see it as one of our primary responsibilities to tell people exactly what's happening with every dollar of the bond funding. And so, to me, coming up with a format for that makes things transparent and easy for people to understand.
So are you thinking just, but I've done annual reports my whole career, so like a balance sheet, if you will, like at the end of like this, is where
No.
the money's coming from and money out.
No.
So
A balance sheet?
More,
I wouldn't.
I'm thinking more,
I don't think.
really project by project, some details about how the money was spent.
Okay,
It's kind of a P&L is what you're really looking.
what was that?
You're looking at your budget to your spend.
Okay,
You've got a set of projects. Here's what we budgeted. Here's what we've spent. Here's what's left. Here's how much contingency we had to tap into.
Right, or we're over
But
because we
I
found.
think you can keep it very simple.
Yeah.
With just individual numbers rather than the entire
Yeah.
expense.
And you could include, oh, here's why we came under budget.
yeah,
And here's why we had to go over budget, and here are the adjustments that were made to smooth things out.
Yeah, like the change orders,
Yeah.
that,
Right, right. But if we come in under budget on the paving, ooh, that's another, 3 million that we can spend elsewhere,
What is this?
Yeah.
See where it says Cliff Drive
Maybe,
entry
and
through.
if we have enough
Is that
interested
the-
people on the committee, maybe we can come up with a subcommittee to work specifically on
It's changing.
this night, because we have some
Paths of
people with
Yes,
ideas
I
and
got it.
experience in this area, so
okay.
that we could possibly recruit.
Do you want, so I guess my question is, do you want to develop a subcommittee now so that we have that to tap into? Because now it's December and.
Now's the time to
Yeah.
doing that.
Well, I
Yeah.
don't want to draft anybody who's not interested in this, but
I'm interested.
there's
I'm
one.
interested.
Okay, we can't make this committee too big. Steve, I was hoping that we could draft you just because of your experience.
Experience there. Yeah.
I'd be happy to work with staff on coming up with a communication plan. I think that's really what we're talking about, is a communication plan to the community. But sure, I'd be happy to do that.
That'd be great. Anybody else? Okay. Well, yeah, if the three of you want to form the subcommittee, you can come up with a name for yourselves. So- And that's not, I mean, we didn't have this on the agenda, but I don't think anybody will be upset with it.
no, because it's
It's
part of the discussion.
Yeah, it's part of the discussion of our report.
And. When we get to future agenda.
Yeah. Somebody want to make a motion?
If we can.
We-
with
no,
no
we
action.
can't.
After
My
discussion item.
Yeah, you're, I think you're fine
I'm fine. Cool.
having
I'll be reaching out.
volunteered.
Yes. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jordan. Okay. Are there any suggestions for future agenda items?
I have one. So at Thursday's board meeting, the board is going to be reviewing a job description for a chief facilities executive. And
great.
that will be somebody who oversees bond projects. So Karen Horan was here today because she works for Kitchell. And we hired them to help oversee the bond project, the PE building, which is a very complex project.
Mhm.
But if you look at the list of projects there are a lot of little projects. So a chief facilities executive that will be paid for with bond funds, perfectly appropriate, will help the college organize and oversee all of those little projects as we hire in contractors to do the smaller ones, to do the architect. So, but it wasn't on this agenda because the board needs to agree to that. So that will appear, and we might even have, be in the middle of the recruitment for that position. Do you have anything else?
No,
Yeah, that sounds like that would be a fairly temporary position.
The position would be only while there are bond funds.
Mhm.
And then when the bond fund goes away, so does the position.
Mhm.
And the advertisement for the position will be very clear. This position subject to the availability of bond funds.
How much salary are we talking about?
It's in the normal range for an executive director.
No, you gotta give
Normal
us-
range, what
I
is,
mean, that's, off the top of my head, I don't know. It's
I think
somewhere between,
120, 150.
yeah, somewhere
That's what I was thinking.
plus
benefits.
benefits?
But it's, when you think about the cost savings, hiring a company.
You gotta have somebody do.
We have to have
Yeah,
somebody because we don't have the internal
Right.
bandwidth to do it. And this is somebody who will be able to manage multiple projects. If, like one of our sister colleges, Long Beach City College, they passed $1 billion bond when we passed this one. So they need a company, like they need a whole company like Kitchell to oversee their whole bond program because it's huge.
Yeah.
This is not a huge bond program, and if we hired a company to do this task for the whole program, it would cost a lot more money. So we're trying to be very efficient. So Kitchell is doing a big project for us, but this individual will oversee. But we'll talk more about it
Okay,
at the
Yeah.
next bond.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in support of
Yeah.
that sort of, the one person who's gonna know everything
Mhm.
and all. I'm just curious about the money, that's all.
I'd like for us to be able to get, because I pulled out this, I think it was from the last meeting, our Board of Trustees agenda item, January through September 25, bond and PE replacement projects related. Things in blue we're responsible for, except I didn't have that blue printer and the black one. Anyway, so if we get these blue items and then the amount that's budgeted to them, because otherwise we're shooting in the dark. I
Okay.
mean, as we go
Yeah, we
along.
can do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Next meeting, we'll have the July through December bond spending report, and that spending report, when I provide those, the board has asked for quarterly updates on both our unrestricted general fund and also on bond projects. And those quarterly reports typically will show, just as you indicated, budgets in various categories, spending in those categories, any encumbered amounts. So that means we have a contract with the company for that amount, so it's on hold until they do their work, and then any remaining amounts.
So we'll just get a copy of those.
Yeah, I'll provide
Oh, yeah.
our board
That's
a report.
just
in
what I'm
January,
talking
and I'll
about.
Provide that report to you.
I think it's really wise to have somebody overseeing your projects. I always had a person
Yeah,
because I knew that person was looking out for our best
Right.
interest
right,
and not the corporation's best interest.
right.
And to the extent that you've got someone that has construction background,
Yes.
Mhm.
I think it really puts the college in a much better position.
Yes.
It's a wise investment.
Me too.
Yeah, and it gives that individual an opportunity to really know the college
Exactly.
inside and out.
Exactly.
Because obviously we have people on campus who do as well.
Yeah.
But this person will bring to bear that knowledge in a different way.
okay. Any other future items anyone wants to suggest?
No.
Okay, in that case, I hereby declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate your
holidays.
help.
There you go. Happy holidays.
We got to pay, right there. Nice to see you too.
We're either in the midst or.
Coming down.
Be in the midst.